Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Mastering Retention podcast. Today is actually a special episode. I don't think I've ever actually had anyone on that isn't specifically in gaming. First off, we have a wonderful little dog with us too, but we also have Natalie Sieradzki, who is actually a UX consultant at Google. And she spends a lot of time kind of helping with user research and interface design and how to do things. And I know we've kind of gotten to connect a little bit over the past few months, and it's been a lot of fun just having chats back and forth. So Natalie, I'm super excited to have you on and to just, delve into a little bit more about like the user experience side of things, especially within gaming. I think it's something that gets overlooked by a lot of gaming companies. And I think there's a lot of kind of improvements or things that can be learned from, apps that are maybe outside of gaming on how do we actually apply these to gaming and just make better experiences overall. So
Definitely.
Natalie, I always like to ask, what's your story? How did you, get to where you're at today?
Yeah, thanks for that intro, Tom. It's been great going back and forth. And yes, definitely, I agree that it's many times it's overlooked, the user experience and designing with user experience in mind and how important that is for retention, since we are in the Mastering Retention podcast. So my story, I'm going to try to shorten it a little bit. I've been always connected to one, market research, to user experience. And actually my first real job was for a company that designed and sold board games for children. And my job, I was always connected to marketing. My job was to actually create loyalty and retention and sell those games even better to our customers. And then I had a series of different jobs. I worked for L'Oreal for a little bit, so like multinationals. And then I went into the startup kind of world. I ended up in this tech startup where my job was being a product marketing manager, but in a startup, you do a little bit of everything. So I started really getting into trying to understand our customers. It was the early times where so many tools were going into the market, where you would be able to chat to your customers, install some tools like Intercom, Hotjar, so you would see some kind of heat maps on what were users doing. And I started really getting into that, I was trying to understand what was important for them, how can I make this business grow even further, and really getting into the psychology part of it. So if I put an image to the right, would people look at it more? If I use these colors for this button, if I work with the design department with that, will this have an impact? So I really got into the psychology part of the consumer. And I realized how important that was for retention in every aspect. So I went on, I did my master's on consumer behavior and market research to try to really add some theory to what I was already doing by spying on our consumers and trying to improve that business. And yeah, that's after that master's, I went into Google, where I've been working first as trying to improve the customer experience for the play environment, for the support experience. And actually now I'm a UX consultant for the apps and gaming world, where I do help developers from mainly Europe, but all over the world, to improve their retention, their engagement, and definitely their monetization. So that's a little bit my story in a nutshell. Of course, it has a lot of more nuances, and it was a hell of a ride, but that's how I got here.
That's great. Okay, I have a lot of questions, but let's maybe start with UX consultant stuff. So I don't know if you can tell me, some games that you've worked with, but let's pretend I have a game. where maybe like unintentionally I kind of made a bit of an Archero clone because I've seen a lot of them that are coming out of late. And let's pretend, I don't know, I have maybe like 30% day one retention. I'm trying to understand, how can I improve this? Like I've got a target of 40% D1 retention before I kind of keep moving on and keep improving my game. But I kind of come to you and it's like, okay, obviously like some people find this fun. Like it's not an atrocious game, but it's not, where I need it to be. What would your approach be to, help a game in that case, identify what are the actual things that I'm doing? I default to looking at, where's my funnel, and I look at the data and are there big cliffs where it's falling off? But sometimes there aren't any like really big cliffs that are falling off, and you're just kind of at a loss of like, well, do I push out the other features that I think it's missing, or do I keep spinning my wheels on this? Do I go to a different game, or are there some ways that I can actually save this game?
Oh man, you could do so many things. We could spend probably the rest of the podcast just talking about this example. Actually, been there, done that, have worked with clones of Archero actually. So the main thing that I would check, for example, is you mentioned you had like this 30% the E1 retention, you want to get to 40. The first thing I would say there is that day 30, day one retention at 30% is not necessarily bad. So one of the things I do first thing first is I try to create a peer group. So I try to check, in this case, probably Archero, and then many other games are targeting the same customers, the same users. They have the same kind of mechanics, the same design. I create this peer group, and then I try to check the average, right? So maybe the average for that specific genre, for that specific game and category, is around 30%, right? So then what I would try to do is compare your game to that peer group, to that aggregate, and try to understand how you're comparing with them. What's the standard? What's the benchmark there? Because a number is not necessarily good or bad by their own, and this changes a lot by one genre to the other, from app category to app category. So let's just do like a health check on how you're doing. Then the second step would try to see, okay, if from this peer group, who is performing at the top? Like, what are the top performers doing? I have this background in UX research, so I do like to do my research. I try to check all these other games, what they are doing good, what they are doing bad in terms of UX. How is their day one? What is their strategy? How's their onboarding like? What's your onboarding like? Are there any obvious differences there? Any obvious flaws? Any obvious UX flows are broken that you could use? What I have seen is that many times developers don't give the importance to the onboarding that they should have. So onboarding has all these purposes, all these amazing kind of resonance with the audience that you might not be leveraging. So I would try to see what's your onboarding like, mainly because day one retention is a consequence. It's a direct consequence of your onboarding, how successful your onboarding is. So if your users are not seeing the value of your game straight away, if they are not getting into the flow, if they are not having fun, within a few minutes of starting your game. If you have ever read the book Hooked by Muriel, I'm sure that this has been mentioned a lot of time in this podcast. I have heard this podcast in the past. You know that the user has this itch, and you need to scratch that itch as soon as possible. So if you're not doing that with your onboarding, if you're not teaching also the main mechanics for the user to be able to scratch the itch, then probably that's going to have an impact on your day one retention. So there are so many aspects, so many things that you can check to make sure that your day one retention is optimized, that I would try to check all of them, right? And specifically as I said, a number is only a number. It's not good or bad, depending on your peer group and how the category is doing.
Okay, I've got a couple questions that I'm guessing that the audience kind of has too. Okay, the idea of putting together a peer group is pretty cool and pretty good. First off, how would I actually find like what my peer group is? Obviously Archero is probably like the top of the list and probably the one that's out there. But what are all of those other games that are doing good that I'm not aware of? And then maybe even more importantly, what are the other Archero clones that are doing terrible and that I could probably learn a lot from, and I don't want to like recreate those. But those ones there's going to be very little information out there. So how do I really appropriately put together like a full picture of a peer group?
So I do two things here. As a developer, you usually know who your main competitors are, but let's put it in a case where you have no clue literally who they are. There are a couple of ways, so I'm not going to advocate for Google. So let's put Google and iOS. Actually, the the Play Store and the iOS, the App Store, they would give you pretty good hints in the related games categories and then on the tags. So each game has some tags. So for example, Archero would have maybe strategy or multiplayer or single player action. So all these tags, you can also follow them and see who are the top grossing games. For example, of course, it requires a little bit of research, a little bit of time from the developer side to try to check those games. I do encourage everyone, check your competition. Of course, if you were to open any other business, you would go, if you were to open like a donuts business, you would go to Dunkin' Donuts, right? Like you would, if you were to open a coffee store, you would go to Starbucks, you would do some kind of research. And for games, it's the exact same thing. You would go and check who is doing best at this category, who is top grossing, who is top selling, who has the best reviews. Reviews can tell you so much about the game. You were asking who is doing badly. So you check who has the worst reviews ever in your category, who has like the same kind of tags that your game would have or has if you have it published. And then you go to the worst and best reviews and you see what customers are saying. And definitely you can learn so much. And there you have your peer groups. I would suggest maybe like 8 to 10 other games, other peers to that peer group. But it's as easy as that. That's the most straightforward way you can do to get your peer group and to compose that.
I like that. Okay. And then you also talked about this idea of an itch that players need to scratch. So, I've got a game. How do I figure out what that itch is that players need to scratch? Like I could maybe come up with some hypotheses or maybe like what I feel when I'm playing that, but is that actually the itch, or is there a formula or a way to figure out this is the itch that I scratch when I play Candy Crush, and this is the itch that players scratch when they play Clash of Clans or whatnot?
There are many types of player profiles. There are many types of itches, but I know in this podcast there has been a lot of talk about motivation. So definitely that's an important thing to keep in mind. We are all human beings, so we do have so kind of common background in terms of our motivation and why we want to do things. And there have been so many reports around why do people play games, for example. And one of the things I always tell developers in my consultations is around progress, and it's around this kind of theory of the self-determination theory. Why do we do things? There are 3 components there. And one of the main components to that theory is around the competence, which is essentially this idea of progression, this idea of mastery, of upskilling. And I see that in many games that's not taken into account. And if you see many reports, across regions, across different player profiles, across different countries. One of the top three reasons that has always come up at the top, might be one, might be two, might be three, but it's always top three, is that feeling of accomplishment. You need to feel accomplished when you play a game, right? So that's one of the main itches that we have as players. You want to feel accomplished somehow. If it's the satisfaction of having three candies in a row and getting that match, or getting somewhere, small objectives, small tasks, that's so important as a developer to understand and to scratch that itch. Of course, then you have like many nuances, many profiles, like people who are a little bit more competitive, a little bit more aggressive. They just want to shoot other people. Some people that want to create. Women, for example, are known in many markets to be more inclined towards fantasy, for example. So anything that you would be able to build like fantasy worlds. So you need to really understand the user to scratch that itch. And I know this is not an easy answer. It's not a one size fits all, but definitely the feeling of accomplishment is something that would be common to everyone. And then what I would say is something I said in one of my recent conferences, which is that you need to know the market, know the user, and know the behavior. It's not the same itch probably, or not the same behavior in somewhere in Saudi Arabia than in Mexico or Brazil or even the US. So you might even need to adapt your game onboarding or some part of the experience to those behaviors, those markets, those users.
Interesting. So a couple kind of follow-ups. So first off, I've heard, and so getting out of gaming a little bit, I've heard that a lot of service companies and apps have this thing that they kind of call this magic moment, where if you can get users to this magic moment, like in Twitter, it's like 10 followers or something, or in Slack, it's like 100 messages. And I don't remember exactly where they are in different things, but it's like, yeah, if we can get users to get this amount of friends in Facebook, they're basically going to be retained, forever. So how do we get more people to this magic moment? Would you say that there is an equivalent magic moment within games, or is it more related to this itch and it's a little bit different for a game versus an app?
Yeah, I would definitely say that there's a magic moment where the user says, and it might not be as evident as it is with an app, like those 7 friends in the first 10 days for Facebook, which is the activation metric. But there's definitely something in gaming that will be that moment where the user gets into the flow, where they want to continue playing, right? When the session length starts to grow, when they go past the onboarding point, when they want to do more on your game, right? When that kind of switch kind of goes on inside the user's brain, where they say, this is actually fun, I actually like this game, I want to see what's out there, what more can this game offer, for sure.
Awesome. And then the second thing that I was kind of noodling over as you were talking about, this idea of achievement, which I think is really important. But I think games do one kind of additional thing, and that's this idea of fantasy. So, to me, I see these, zombie movies, and it probably wouldn't actually be that much fun to live through in a zombie apocalypse. But I do have some curiosity around, what would I do in that case? Like, would I survive? How would I play? How would that actually play out? So like that fantasy might be interesting to live. I don't really want to live back in like the feudal days where, there was knights and castles and stuff, but I'm kind of curious what it would be like to, be a baron and have, an army of troops, and to be able to, conquer another castle. And, I've got these different fantasies and things. I think games give us this unique opportunity where you can kind of capitalize and actually allow people to experience some of these fantasies in ways that wouldn't otherwise be possible. How do you think fantasy kind of ties into this idea of scratching an itch?
I think it goes in the same way as we were talking before. You can do any type of genre. You can do fantasy, but you by always keeping in mind what the user motivation behind everything. Yes, you would have that motivation of knowing what it's like to live in this kind of world, but you also need an additional type of thing that would allow you to either progress or to socialize, or this need that we have of like autonomy to kind of create your own world. So as long as you are, as a developer, kind of addressing this either of these needs, or ideally the three of them, that would definitely go along with games in fantasy, or even within a puzzle, right? You mentioned that, of course, you would like to know what was like maybe to be a baron and to have like these armies, but some people just want to maybe do this crossover puzzle, or just do a jigsaw puzzle. But there's always this kind of common elements of motivation behind all of them. So it's just about tearing down what's the main structure behind everything, right? So when you're creating a game, so I'm not expert in creating games, so I just want to put this out there. But by working in this industry, I have tried to do like some courses on game design and trying to understand a little bit more. And one of the things is that kind of the basics of any game is the same, right? You have some rules that the user needs to follow, and then some basic structure. And to that basic structure, of course, you can add some fantasy elements, you can add some knights, you can add some armies, but then you can add just simply like swapping pieces and exploding things like Candy Crush, right? But what's underlying that, what's behind all of that, that's kind of a basic structure that the user needs to understand. And above that, you can build whatever you want, as long as you always keep in mind what's the user motivation. If you don't address the user motivation, you might have the best game in your opinion of knights and barons and castles and knights, but it probably won't be a huge success because you're not addressing anything that the user is motivated by, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Super interesting. Okay. I do want to talk a little bit about the peer group idea. So let's say I've put together my group of 8 to 10 games, and I find that Archero is at the top of the list, and they have like day one retention of what, like 60%. I don't actually know where they're at, but I think it's like 50 to 60%. So I'm obviously far below that. I might find a few little things in my onboarding experience that I can, suss through and work out and stuff. But I'm still kind of underperforming. Do you think that there is a value in trying to talk to the players directly, either like on the phone or a Zoom or a survey or something like that? And how would you go about it? And would you try to focus more on the people that came back the second day to understand, like, why did you come back? Or is it more important to try to figure out, and I think this is the harder group, but the people that just like downloaded the game and then just churned? Because obviously there's a disconnect. I mean, it's not like it's easy to get someone to download your game, right? Like, you've got to show them an ad, and most people just see those ads go by. So it's got to be an enticing enough ad that I clicked it. I got into the, Google Play Store or Apple, and I see the screenshots. It still looks engaging. The description's enticing enough for me to download it. Not only do I download it, but I actually have to open up the game and then like start playing it. And then I churn out. And so obviously somewhere in there was a disillusionment of what I thought I was getting and what I was actually getting. Because in theory, it looked like that game should have been fun to me, right?
I think you just hit a nerve, to be honest, because yes, as I mentioned, I did UX research for quite a while. I'm super passionate about research and researching the user. So there's massive value, and I cannot stress this enough in talking to your users, both the current users and the churned ones. I can't even stress how important it is to try to talk to all of your user groups. Definitely, your current players can tell you why they keep on playing, what they find valuable, what they think can be improved. But definitely, the churned ones can tell you what's wrong with your game, right? What made them churn, and that's for me, and this is my personal opinion, it's the most valuable of all feedbacks. They can tell you the exact reason why they decided to leave, why they decided to leave at that specific point, what was the hurdle, what were the obstacles they couldn't overcome, what was bad enough for them to decide to churn, and that's super valuable. And just how to go about that, what I see usually is that developers are, and I see this also with notifications, just like talking to user, they have this fear of annoying the user, and this is just a fun fact in between. There are many studies around notifications, push notifications, and there were studies that were kind of testing out what was better to do, like maybe 2 push notifications a month, 3 push notifications every 2 weeks, something like that. And then there was one group that they were testing out by, and they were sending 2 push notifications a day, and the ones that had the best retention of all of them, between 3 to 10x retention compared to the other ones, were the ones that were sending 2 notifications a day, right? And I see so many developers being super worried about sending push notifications, annoying the user. But as long as they have value, as long as you're giving something to the user, as long as there is a call to action, it's relevant, it's personalized, everything is okay. The user wants to hear from you. And that's the same, it's the same thing for research. Users are always happy to talk about their experiences. You just need to reach out to them. And I actually was using this app recently, and I actually became a subscriber. And after, I don't know, like 2 3 weeks after, I received an email from the founders of the app, from the developers. And they were saying, hey, do you have maybe 2 minutes? We'd love to talk to our customers, learn about their experience. We would be happy to set up a call, and maybe they have like a Calendly link, or they have another type of link, or just reply to this email if you would be willing. So it's just about taking the initiative and reaching out to your users. And more times that you would think, they are willing to talk to you and tell you about their experience, and happy to contribute to create a better game for them and in their experience and for the community. So I would encourage any developer just listening to this, just reach out to your users by any means. You can also use pop-ups in your game, like a chat pop-up, like, hey, we value you as a customer, as a player. Would you give us your opinion? Would you share your thoughts? And then maybe you can add a link to some other landing page where you can do that, where you would have either the possibility to chat to them, or to I don't know, to register to another time slot that works for both of you. But just take the first step, just reach out. Users are always happy to share their experience and to tell you more about their experience with your game.
So, in the case of, well, I mean, we live in the world of GDPR now, right? And so I feel like there's this hypersensitivity to, collecting email addresses and things like that. But like, if a user hasn't given me push notifications and they've churned and I don't have their email, there's, really no way for me to get in touch with them that, I can think of. So, is that something that you'd, recommend like early in the game, when I'm just trying to understand, like a pop-up of like, hey, we'd love to get to know you better and see how we're doing, would it be okay if we shot you an email and set up a call? and, optionally let them put that in, or like a survey that's early in there, and then like an optional question at the end of the survey of like, can we get in contact with you to, go over other questions or hop on a call? If so, put your email here. Like, is that, something that you would do, or, is it trying to get them to enable push notifications so you can like hit them with one like last dish push notification or something like that?
Well, what I would say there is first rely on your data. So first knowing when users are churning. If you have like a margin, let's say like the first 3 minutes or 4 minutes, don't just do it at the first thing when the user gets into your game, right? You want your user to experience as much of your game as possible without any additional things. And the same goes for push notifications. One of the things that we always recommend, and that we see all the time actually, is for developers that have an iOS version. You open up the game and the first thing you see is, hey, do you want to receive push notifications? And you have like no context of the game. You haven't seen anything about it. You don't know if you like it or not, the value. So one of the things we always recommend is you wait for the right moment and you do it right. Like there are many examples out there, games that are doing it really in a really cool way, or apps that do it in a really cool way. They give you something. For example, you can see the value of something on the app or the game, like a daily reward, for example, right? You get into a game, you play for like a minute or two, they give you this daily reward, and after that they can tell you something like, hey, don't miss out on the next daily rewards, or we have some random great rewards every once in a while. Be sure to have your push notifications activated. Do you want to activate them? Yes, no. And then if they say yes, then you would kind of send that trigger messaging asking the user to allow those notifications, but not before, not without any context, not without the user experiencing a little bit of your game. So the same thing goes for users who you want to chat to. Take into account your margin, take into account your analytics, your data. Of course, if it's like 1 minute, they haven't experienced anything, you can just assume that you will lose some of them and you won't be able to get them back. And that those are users that are going to churn and you won't be able to talk to them. But there are some users who you might be able to catch after, right? So maybe after a few minutes, yes, you can have maybe associated to a reward, for example, like, hey, we want to give you this, but first to receive it, can you just, I don't know, like either give us your email, or would you be able to talk to us, for 5 minutes and get this amazing whatever item, something of value, right? That's the thing about rewards. If you just give out anything, maybe it doesn't work. But if you give something of value to someone who is in the first few minutes experiencing your game, and being honest. I love honesty as a policy from developers. Sometimes you see developers saying, we do have advertising in this game for users who don't do any in-app purchases because we need to survive somehow. And I think that kind of candid honesty is like the best policy. You kind of create this connection with the user, which is great. So we would have to do the same to get users to talk to you. Just wait for the right moment. Don't do it as soon as they open the game. Maybe offer something in return. And of course, for games that have a login option, that's great because you might be able to catch their emails. So if it's something that you can do without annoying the user too much, like having social login, telling the user the benefits. If they use social login, maybe they get like 5,000 coins they can use for whatever. Then that's something you can also leverage.
Yeah, that's really great. App or a game that I've seen the push notification invites done perfectly in is Playtika's Slotomania. And they do it basically just how you outlined. It's like, it doesn't happen right away. You're into the game a ways, and then they don't even about it. Like there's a little dot, like you click it, you get this like daily reward, and it's like, do you want to get more of these or get notified when they happen? And then it, if you say yes, then they give you the push notification. Like it's brilliantly done. I've actually had, some game developers argue against that, where they said, well, we've A/B tested it, and if I just put it in right away, I actually get like 10% more people to opt in. And I haven't had a lot of great things to say against that, but I would argue that if you really dwell down from a data standpoint and understand of the users that stick around and actually engage in those notifications and find them helpful, I would think that the ones that you invited later would actually have a much more meaningful impact, even if the total number that opted in might be smaller. But I don't know. One last thing before we delve into market research, and that is this idea of Discord. So a lot of games lately have, especially, soft launched early stage games have started kind of putting together like a Discord server, and like they have like a persistent, button where you can just kind of join their Discord server or what have you. Have you had any experience with that? Recommendations around that? Is that a good way to like get people to actually engage with you and, give you that feedback? Or, is it going to skew towards just the already very engaged people and you're going to miss the greater mass?
I think it's just one alternative. I'm a big fan of data and A/B testing. So there are many, many tools out there. Of course, at Google, we use Firebase, but I know developers use their own tools or third-party tools. I have nothing against Discord. I think if used right, it can be a great tool. You always need to do some priming, though. You need to prime the user before something, persistently ask the user to do something, or it's just another element of your UI. So again, like this honesty policy, like, hey, we would love to talk to you. We have this icon right here. You can even darken the screen. You can do it like a small queue that where you can connect with us, right? And I have seen many users who are grateful for that, because either they get stuck in the onboarding, they want to connect to someone, and it's a great tool. But as with any tool, you need to know how to use it and how to use it right. So what I would say there is definitely prime the user, tell them something before that comes out of nowhere. And then the other thing is A/B test, right? Maybe Discord works for you, but maybe it would work. There are other tools that would work better. So definitely it's about checking what works best with your game, when and where, doing like different timings, different placements, and seeing how the users respond to that. So big fan of data, big fan of checking, minute to minute how that evolves and how that works. And if it works, then great. If not, maybe it's just about testing some other tools or some other options.
That's awesome. I love that. Okay. So I want to switch gears and spend probably most of the last of the time that we have together talking about market research. So especially in game development. Now, I actually come a little bit from market research background too, so I'm a fan of it. But there are some stigmas in gaming when it comes to like giving your players surveys or trusting that data at all versus like, just being data driven or informed or whatever you want to call it. I personally like trying to have a complete picture of using what the player's done and aligning that with what the players have actually said, and to get just like a complete picture. But I'm, curious, in the past, like, have you seen surveys done well, and have you seen them done poorly? And like, when should I actually use a survey, and like, who should I try to give that to? Should it be just my players? Should it be, I try to give a survey to players in a game that isn't mine to like understand what they like about that? Or illuminate us.
Okay, so this is just going a little bit into the basics of like market research and like surveys, when to use them. So surveys, and I'm going to try to be non-boring with this, and just going into the very basics. So surveys is more of a quantitative method, which means that it's kind of a massive method. You would use it for when you have like many users that you want to get their feedback on, and of things that maybe they don't require as many insights as possible. So closed options, right? Maybe you have like pre-filled options, some standardized options that you're giving the users, and then you let them choose from all of those options one of them, and then you try to see which one was the one that got the most votes, for example. And with quantitative, what you try to do usually is try to prove a hypothesis, right? So for example, what you would do is ideally when you're doing market research or user research is you would talk to user first. So that's more qualitative. You do like a one-to-one kind of method, or kind of a more a method that requires less people. And then from talking to those users, from maybe those interviews, from those usability testing, you develop an hypothesis. And maybe you say, in my onboarding, if I change this for that, then I think that I would improve my day one retention by X. And then that's when the survey comes in. You have a very clear objective. So for good service, you have to have a very clear objective with what you want to prove or demonstrate or to get from that survey. And then you would send that survey to a kind of more massive audience than the one you had when you were doing this other kind of method, maybe like the usability testing, which is one-to-one, or an interview, right, which is one-to-one. So you take those insights from maybe these more qualitative methods, and then you translate them into your survey to try to prove those points, or maybe to disprove them, right? To try to get something very specific out of that survey. You wouldn't be asking very kind of what they are called closed questions, like, do you like our game? Yes, no. Do you think our reporting is good? Yes, no, right? You would try to get these other kind of closed options that tell you something very specific from an hypothesis you already have. If that makes sense, to your question, Tom, when to use surveys.
Yeah, super interesting. I like that a lot. Do you think that there is value in trying to do, guess how would I say, like a segmented survey? Like if I can, okay, for an example, let's say I ran a special time limited event this last weekend over Labor Day. It's like a Labor Day event. And I noticed that of the 100,000 players that logged in, only 50,000 of them actually engaged in that event. So would there be value in trying to give a survey just to the 50,000 people that didn't engage in that event, to ask them, why didn't you do that? Something like, I didn't know about it, or the rewards weren't interesting, or, I didn't have time, or something else, such that the next time that I run that event, hopefully I can use that information to make a better version of it. Like if 50% of them just didn't know that it was even going on, then maybe I just need to like change how I'm doing my messaging and the introduction to it or whatnot. And maybe now it's only 30% of those people no longer don't engage in it.
Definitely. I'm a huge fan of audience segmenting for everything, not only surveys. So just like tailoring the experience of your game to different audiences. This is something I always stress in our consultations. Different markets behave differently, so you can't treat your game the same for a user in Brazil than for a user in Germany or the US. They have different behaviors, different purchase behavior, different kind of tolerance to ads, for example, different tolerance to the risk, different like reward preferences, and you need to figure those out to make the most out of your game and to really resonate with those audiences. And it's the same with surveys, right? You need to segment your audience and to try to get the most out of these different audiences that are generated with different either events on your game or with different stages. So you would have a survey for the onboarding, you would have a survey survey for users who stuck with you until day 30, what's called day 30 retention. You would have a survey for users who are your highest engaged cohort, and then for the least engaged cohort. And definitely for if you do an event, you would want to know why people didn't engage with it. Wasn't it attractive enough? Was the timing wrong? Was it not promoted enough? Was it too short, for example? And definitely listening to that feedback is key to try to do it better in the future. And this is one mistake I've seen over and over, which is not listening to user feedback, right? I see many developers wondering, like, what do we do next in our roadmap? And sometimes when we do the consultation, when we do, the kind of UX teardown, we tell them some things and they are like, oh yeah, we have this in our roadmap for like, in 2 years, but we might like rethink that and do it now, right? So it's just about learning what those users for that event found useful or not, insightful or not, and then using that information to improve your game, right? It's not worth it to do like all the work of a market research or a user research if you're not going to use that in a valuable way for your game. Of course, you don't have to do everything that the user suggests, but again, if you do have an hypothesis, you can get some very valuable insights and adjust your roadmap and future live ops depending on the feedback you get.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a little bit about survey questions now, because I think it's very easy to do what's called a leading question, where you encourage the answers. So I'm actually going to ask you, in that example, pretend I have a game, we ran a Labor Day weekend event. How would you actually go about writing it? And for the audience, just before we get to that, a leading question would basically be something like, if you've ever seen any of the US political ads, when somebody's going to be elected, you see the ad for Trump put on by, let's say, Biden, and it's like, did you know that Trump does, XYZ to children or whatnot? And then, an associated survey question would be like, do you agree with Trump harming children? And I don't think any of this stuff exists, but like, it kind of leads you to where it's like, well, I better say no, because I don't want to like agree with that thing. And there's lesser versions of that too, but that's kind of the idea of like, if you're not careful about wording the question just right, it can encourage people to think that they want you to, or you want them to answer a certain way, and then they do, and that can skew your results because it's not what they actually believe.
So, yeah, definitely. And for gaming, you can say something like, how fun was this event? And that's also a leading question, right? Because you're assuming the user found your event fun. So something not leading would be something like, how did you find this event? And then you give the user some options, or you can have an open-ended question for the user to tell you what they thought, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I find open-ended questions can be very illuminating if you get players that are willing to engage in them, but they can also be, really tedious to go through. So, do you have recommendations of when you would use open-ended versus, just like a closed poll? Like if I know it's probably one of these 5 options, would that be where I, do the multi-choice versus an open-end where I really have no idea what this is, so I just want to see the spectrum and understand?
Yeah, so I think closed questions, as I said, you have more of an hypothesis of what might be going on after you had like some initial research with your users. So like a few things about the event, right? Like you have a spectrum of users find it from tedious to boring to, not worth it. But you would use a more open question probably when you want to gather some insights on some other aspects that you don't really have that previous theory from that hypothesis. So you want to test that out with those users. So just let me know, for example, about your experience. You want just to gather something more general, for example, from the game itself. So you're asking about an event, but then you want to ask the user, like, can you describe, how would you describe our game? Or, what do you think are the improvements or the next features that we should include in our game, right? You don't have a theory about that. You just want the user to express themselves freely, and that can be of massive value too, right? If you talk to the right users, because you might start seeing that some patterns repeat themselves, and this is something I have seen a lot in research. Like, what are the things that are not working well, and then you start seeing some patterns, and that's the value, that's the beauty of research, right? You start seeing some patterns, you start seeing that, oh, many users mentioned whatever about this game, so maybe we should pay closer attention to this feature. Maybe we should develop this other thing.
That's awesome. Oh, and I have so many more questions, but I know we're out of time here. So I have one last unofficial question for you, because it is the Mastering Retention podcast. That is, what's one tip or trick or lesson you've learned over the years? How do you keep players around for longer in a game?
I think it all comes down to these kind of three key concepts, which is knowing the market, knowing the user, and knowing the behavior. That definitely includes data, but it includes research. So, and one trick that I would want to put out there is that many developers think about research as something that has to be done by experts. It's so foreign to them. It's so far away from what they do day to day. But actually, you can do a usability testing by just grabbing your game and showing it to your grandma, for example, right? Just to know about if there are any usability issues, any friend, who is maybe not that close to you, or some family member that doesn't have any shyness in telling you the truth. You would just give them your game and ask them to play, and ask them to do some specific tasks, for example. And then you can see, how your game plays out, the usability of your game, if there are like any issues. And I have seen like so many issues that could be prevented, before launching it to the market. If you would do that, if you would just take any being that's close to you and show them your game and ask them to perform a few tasks and see how they do it and see if that's clear, so many issues could be prevented. So usability testing is not something that has to be done by an expert, has to be done by a team. You need to hire someone. You can just do it yourself as a developer. So definitely key to knowing the users. Do a research on the market you're launching your game to, know what users like, what they don't like, what they are afraid of, how in-app purchases work in that market. Brazil, for example, doesn't have that much of a high penetration of credit cards. So how do you solve for that? Are you going to partner with any local, for example, provider, suppliers of payments, or are you going to offer some other things? So just keep that in mind. Know the market, know the user, know the behavior, and that's definitely something that's key for mastering retention.
That's great. That's so good. Well, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully we can maybe have you back at some point in the future as well. If folks do want to get a hold of you, is there a good way to reach out?
Definitely just search for me on LinkedIn. I'm active there. Or Tom, I know in your LinkedIn we have talked a bit, so feel free to also mention me, and anyone who wants to reach out, feel free to connect with me there.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Thanks, Tom.